Hi there. This is Dr. Paul from drpauldobransky.substack.com. Today, I would like to talk with you about probably the most important concept in all of psychology, the most important psychological tool that applies in all kinds of relationships interpersonally with others, from romantic relationships to family relationships, friendships, business transactions, every kind of human interaction, and is the topic of personal boundaries. Now, one of the most interesting applications of personal boundaries is also a hot topic for the last several years, and that is pertaining to narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and pathologic narcissism. When I was a young man getting into psychiatry after medical school, I had a mentor named Horatio Fabrega, and I asked him what his subspecialty was. He told me he's kind of a vampire hunter. What he meant by that is that he's an anthropologic psychiatrist. He's now deceased, but at the time I found it very interesting that he studied folklore in a psychological context. He told me monster stories have taught whole cultures about the perils of narcissism throughout the ages, and that you find vampire, zombie, and other monster stories in every culture through human history. Narcissists are both just as frightening and just as weak or empty as vampires, with the thirst for life essence they lack, whether that is in the form of blood in the vampire tales or simply in the form of emotional energy, the self-esteem of our everyday psychology. Thus, some of the terminologies from today's concept of narcissistic abuse, where you hear of devaluation being a major kind of psychological technique used by narcissists. The devaluation really is more than just putting you down. It's taking your self-esteem from you. And that's what's symbolic about blood in vampire tales. So vampires and monster stories throughout history are essentially designed to teach populations about narcissism and how to avoid it. Let's get to the topic of personal boundaries. One of the easiest ways to understand them in depth and all of their intricate anatomy is through a visual means, drawing a circle. So I use a lot of circles in explaining boundary dynamics to people. I always start with talking about what I call holes in the boundary. So there's a hole in a circle, maybe even multiple holes in a circle. And what the edge of that circle represents for all of us is the limits of what we own and control, which is on the inside of the circle, the boundary, versus what we don't control at all, which is everything outside that circle. So you can imagine the edge of the boundary working very much like the border of a country. There are rules for you to allow people in to your intimate thoughts and feelings in your personal boundary. In fact, there are three kinds of general psychological resources stored in that boundary, almost like a tank of fuel. You can imagine a fluid level at the bottom of a circle, and there are three kinds of contents. One we've already mentioned, self-esteem, which takes two forms, confidence and well-being in my romantic dynamics model. The second kind of resource is that which is cognitive or intellectual. In other words, it's ideas, which can include beliefs, education, and even the narrative story of your life, the events of it, the experiences you've had. It's all data. It's in your memory. The third kind of contents inside the boundary generally include the ability to make decisions for which we want to pursue wisdom of decisions. Wisdom of our decisions means our decisions tend to lead to good outcomes much or most of the time. And what composes our freely willed decision making and empowers it tends to be also two things. One is conscience or conscientiousness or ethics. That's about how am I treating others and what feedback do I get from them about how they feel treated. We learn a sense of ethics, part of our morality. But the other important aspect of wise decision making, you could call shrewdness, or I like to call it intuition, which is your sense built on past experiences in various kinds of environments. How do those environments tend to treat you pertaining to a kind of decision you tend to make in those environments? And over time, you get better and better with you might call it a gut sense, an intuition about what is possible for you, leading to good outcomes in various environments. These two together, conscience and intuition, if honed well, become wisdom of decision making. All of these things are inside your boundary. As I've said, what's outside of your boundary is not in your control. If you imagine that circle again, what's outside that circle are all kinds of things: the economy, traffic, the weather, other people. None of this do you completely control. So back to holes in the boundary and how do they work? Holes in the boundary essentially are places where you can't see outside the boundary looking any different from what is inside your boundary if you're looking out a boundary hole. And so it's an illusion. It's actually the ego defense called denial, the most primitive ego defense. It's where you might actually come to believe and be in denial of the limits of what you actually own and control about your world. And it's an illusion caused maybe through no fault of your own. If you're a young child, they have lots of holes in their boundary. But through no fault of your own, you might simply be looking out a hole in your boundary as if you were looking out an open window in your house. And it feels like everything you see, you own and control. Yet, when faced with the reality that there really is a boundary there, a limit of what you own and control, you will at some point come face to face with the fact you actually don't control what you're looking at. This leads to a kind of frustration and an expenditure of your resources, such as your energy of self-esteem, making efforts to frustratingly try to control that which you don't. And that definitely includes other people. Your time, which is like a currency of your intellect, your life story, your education. It takes time to grow these storehouses of data and memory. And finally, your freedom you might be spending on trying to control that which you don't control. That's the currency of your decision making. It's freedom. The better decisions you make, by the way, the more freedom you're given by society, which could be called leadership. Leadership has more freedom to make decisions than those subordinate to them. Well, you lose that too. So what is this process called? Well, Buddhists once called it suffering. Suffering is trying to control the uncontrollable, burning energy and time and resources, maybe even money, on that which you don't control. This anatomy of the boundary, these holes where one tries to exert control and fools themselves into thinking they actually control other people or even acts of God, the weather, the blizzard, the tornado, and find face to face with an obstacle that they don't indeed control it, then they're burning energy on it. That's what suffering is. We all do it at least a little bit because we all have some holes in our boundary. It's why the self-psychologists Kohut and Kernberg once said that we all have some degree of narcissism. We're all narcissists. The question is to what degree? Well, I'm telling you, part of the degree is the amount of holes in the boundary in the person. The more holes, the more suffering. The more holes, the more attempting to control the uncontrollable about the world. And what's worse, through holes in the boundary, if you imagine that circle with holes in it again, anything that comes along in nature, in the environment, good or bad, ends up easily getting in to our boundary. It lands in our lap. And then we start to call this good luck or bad luck because nature and the environment is neutral. Random things happen. It means us no harm and it means us no good either. It's random. So it seems like you have bad luck when bad things land in your boundary. It seems like you have good luck when good things just randomly happen to land in your boundary. And that's no way to live a life because it means the uncontrollable, the environment, through that hole in the boundary. Imagine an arrow coming into the boundary and circling around and then leaving through the hole. The uncontrollable controls you entirely. So you are a boat with no oars, a ship with no sails, adrift at sea in your life. And this is exactly how a narcissist exists and feels, both weak and pitiful and desperate for what they have called supply, which is the self-esteem, the time, the attention, the resources of others, maybe even the money of others. And they're always looking for the next supply when they drain a, quote, victim of their resources through these holes. So boundary holes are the source of all suffering. There are all kinds of human suffering. And suffering amounts to trying to control the uncontrollable and burning all your resources on that until you are depleted. One good verbal technique, linguistic technique to recognize suffering or holes in the boundary is any controlling kind of language. One of the best words or synonyms for it would be the word should. When you hear people say, you really should treat me differently, or traffic shouldn't be so traffic jammy. People should be courteous. You should wear a different outfit. Anytime you hear someone use the word should, it's implying pretty obviously that they're wishing they had control over something that they don't. And they're actually burning energy on that, trying to control it, which they don't. So they will end up draining their own energy. The same is true if you say the word should or think the word should, and you're frustrated and you're burning energy. You're feeling maybe more sad, more depressed, or more anxious as you lose those two types of self esteem through your boundary holes called well being and confidence. You become more angry and sad, or you become more anxious, or both. So boundary holes also act much like holes in the tank of fuel we described earlier, a circle with a liquid at the bottom of it. Only now imagine holes through which that liquid is draining out until you're depleted, your gas tank empty. So this is the first of several pieces of boundary anatomy for us to cover together. I thought it would be very valuable to describe it visually in this way. And you can feel free to write me at drpauldobransky.substack.com or become a member where we have weekly video meetings about any and every topic in psychology, especially those surrounding character, maturity, narcissism, relationships between the sexes, and human courtship. Thank you, and I hope to talk to you soon.